I would appreciate if you commented as well on what you think is the contribution of systemic disruptions in Africa.
It's a mixed picture. I mean, one of the most successful things we have going in Africa at the moment is the growth of the private sector and the growth of the tax revenue base, particularly from the corporate side. And I think that does change the dynamic for governments in terms of corruption, for example. I think that, and you have a very good example in Uganda at the moment, where we'll see how the money is spent, but the contracts which have been delivered on the oil in Uganda are pretty well written. They are on a much higher level in terms of transparency and in terms of legal standing than what would have happened 20 years ago in Africa. So we can say that there's a lot of advances in the rule of commercial law, especially in Africa. A lot of advances in revenue generating in all respects, which may offset the systemic problems. So that's one thing. Regional integration. I mean, African Union, with respect to my Pan-Africanist friends, I'm very, very skeptical about the African Union. I think the African Union is a very expensive talking shop which hasn't really delivered for African people yet. But what is delivering, and pretty quickly actually, and surprisingly, are the regional, the SADCs and the East African Community and ECOWAS. These are really doing, and part of the reason is because middle-ranking civil servants in African countries are fed up of their political masters, and they see that as an avenue to create cooperation with their neighboring countries. And corporations like it, because it's a bigger market for soap and whatever. And the people don't really know about it yet. But this month is obviously the first month of a common market in the East African community. And that would mean, for example, a box of cornflakes produced in the industrial area here in Nairobi will now be sold in Burundi or in the back end of Rwanda. And that starts to create new markets, On the negative side, in terms of the risk, I think what we have to understand is that environmentally and in terms of urban life, unemployment, not being able to employ your young men is an enormous political risk. And that will drive conflict in Africa unless that is dealt with. But Kenya is just about one of the most dynamic economies in Africa, and it needs to produce something like 550,000 new jobs this year to stand still, to accommodate all the people coming onto the marketplace. And it's producing about 80 to 100,000 new jobs. Now that's a dynamic economy that can produce that many jobs. But when you look at that shortfall, now I'm not saying all those other 400,000 people are completely unemployed. In some kind of African way, they're working for their cousin 2 days a month, they're hawking stuff, they have a shamba. But basically it's bad news. It's really bad news. And that means if we just take Kenya for example, any political flashpoint, like the constitutional vote, like the election, can be exploited by populist politicians, and you can end up with a lot of blood on the streets. So I think political risk is the really... And the one thing which I still haven't got a handle on is the climate change question in arid environments. I mean, some of the science papers I read are suggesting, 20 to 30% fall in food production in arid countries, and obviously the volatile rainfall, that which, you know, people don't know when to plant their harvest, they lose their harvest, and that could be a really nightmarish thing if your population of your village is doubling at the same time, you know.